All right, well, Shadow Warrior 3 looks kind of interesting. I'll admit I haven't actually played the other games in this series. But when I saw the system requirements, because, I look at that kind of thing because I make videos about it, I'm actually seeing these screenshots, a little bit of video here, reading the a description of the game, and this does kind of look interesting to me. I might have to check this one out. Now, sliding myself out of the way here, the release date on this one, if you've missed it, is March 1st. So we're coming up there, right? A little bit. And thankfully, these developers have done something that seems to be just absolutely elusive to so many other developers, which is just throwing in the additional notes what resolution and frame rate and settings these recommendations are targeting. I love it when studios give us the big chart where we have multiple resolutions and all of that, but honestly, this is enough. If you're gonna give us a minimum and a recommended, please just tell us roughly what sort of performance we're expecting from those settings, because your minimum might not be the same thing as my minimum when it comes to what we're willing to live with. Some people would go with 720p 30 and call it a day. Some people are like, if it's less than 1080p 60 at low settings, it's junk and it's unplayable, right? Anyway, so the good news is here, our minimum requirements here are telling us that this is an average of 30 FPS at 1080p on low settings, and that our recommended are bumping that up to 60 FPS at high settings, so doubling that frame rate and increasing the graphical settings. Now it says high, and I don't know if high is going to be the highest graphical settings. A lot of games have an ultra or epic setting above that, but usually, high is going to either be the top or high, near the top. Anyway, so what do we actually notice here? The first thing that pops out to me is that it has some really low-end CPUs recommended for that 30 FPS, and I'll just leave it at that. I mean, we've got ourselves a really old i5-3470, which is, it even tells us, guys, like, I love that this is a basic Steam chart system requirements list, but this developer actually went into a little effort here. They're telling us that that's a 4-core and telling us the clock speeds. And the same thing with this AMD Phenom 2 4-core at 3400. So interesting there. But the recommended requirements do jump up quite a bit. It's a little bit interesting here. We're going with a Ryzen 7 2700, which is an 8-core CPU, but a few generations ago, right? After the 2000 series, we had the 3000, and then the 5000 series is the latest AMD Ryzen processors. So a few generations back. And then this i7, they're going with the 6950X, which seems like an odd choice to me because that was a 10-core, 20-thread, like absolute top-end chip. I don't think a lot of people are going to have this specific chip. But what I'm kind of reading into this is that the fact that they're recommending 8-core or even 10-core here is that this can probably at least take advantage of 8 cores, and that's probably going to be smoothing things out quite a bit here. And they are jumping up a few generations. So I'd just say if you have a, 8-core processor, or I'd imagine a 6-core 12-thread, especially if it's a little bit newer, you're probably going to be good to go on stable frame rates with your CPUs. Notice the 2700, while it is 8-core, didn't have super high single-threaded gaming performance. So it's looking like you'll be able to hit 60 even without some new, like, really high-end gaming chips. So that's good. The next thing that jumps out to me is the memory at minimum is 8 gigabytes, which is pretty standard these days. But it's also only at 8 gigabytes on recommended, which we almost always see jump up to 16 for recommended. So good news, I guess, for anybody who hasn't upgraded to 16 gigabytes of RAM yet. Although, like, do that, guys. It's like $50 maybe. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, I'd recommend going up to 16 gigabytes of RAM if you don't have it, but at least this game doesn't need it. Now, the graphics cards. Again, very large jump here. So at the low end, remember this is targeting 1080p 30 FPS at low settings. We've got the R7 260X and the GTX 760, and both of these are specifying that you want 2 gigabytes of VRAM. And then on the recommended, we're jumping up to the RX 5700 and the GTX 1080, and they are specifying 8 gigabytes of VRAM on each of those. Now, that does give you a lot of wiggle room between 2 gigabytes and 8 gigabytes, so I'd imagine by tweaking some settings, you won't necessarily need that. Now, what does this mean for you if you don't have these exact GPUs? Well, I recommend the chart over here at Tech PowerUp as a very good relative performance chart, and you can also dig into a lot of the details on these specific GPUs. Like we can find out that the GTX 1080, which was the recommended NVIDIA card, is a 2016 card now at this point, with that 8 gigabytes of memory and all of that. So we can dig in here. Now, what other GPUs are similar to that? Well, like they recommended, the RX 5700 for AMD. And if you're on something like a 2060, that's also basically the equivalent card, although you'd have your RTX features, which I'm honestly not sure whether or not this game is featuring any DLSS or ray tracing. Now, dropping a little bit below that would be something like a 5600 XT. By the way, it's not on the chart here, but an RX 6600 is also going to be very similar performance here, usually somewhat in line with a 2060 Super, which is actually a bit above our recommendations, which brings me into, okay, the chart didn't tell us what do you need for 1440p high setting 60 FPS. Well, technically 1440p is, I think, like a 77% jump in pixels, but the pixels don't scale perfectly with the performance demand because I don't think every GPU calculation is per pixel, right? So I would imagine jumping up here into this about 50% more performance range would probably be about what you'd need rather than needing to go all the way up to like a 77% jump. So that would put you into probably this 3060 Ti, 6700 XT, 2080 Super, maybe 2080. This class of card, based on their recommendations, I would expect to be just fine at 1440p. And again, if you're targeting 4K, at higher settings, as usual, I really would recommend having a 3080 or 6800 XT, or just turn a few settings down on a lower class of card. Now, as we drop down below the recommended settings, there's a big jump all the way down to, what was it, a GTX 760 and a 260X? So let's explore kind of the in-between, right? So as you drop below the recommend settings, you can either keep the settings at high if you have enough VRAM, but your frame rate will start to drop below 60, or you could start to turn down some settings to still trying to maintain 60 FPS until the point where that's just no longer possible and you're dropping down to that 30 FPS at low settings like they recommended. So as we scroll down here, you can see you can expect this percentage of that frame rate at the high settings or be turning down some settings. And this gets you through a lot of popular cards like a 1660. I'm sure you can still hit 60 FPS by just turning down a few settings below the high settings. That would be absolutely reasonable. Getting down to our GTX 1060, I imagine we're going to have to turn things down pretty low to hit 60, and maybe I'll even be able to test this one out on my channel if I end up getting this game when it launches. I do have a 1066 gigabyte for testing. But how far down do we actually have to go to get to that GTX 760? See, that's a 33% roughly of the performance of the 1080, although cards this far apart on the relative performance chart, that can be a little bit weird. So if we again set this 760 as the baseline, I did get that number right, just making sure I'm not messing up my video. All right, so if we do set this as the baseline, so again, if we think about this as 1080p 30 FPS low settings, that means that then if you're willing to go down to 720p, maybe 900p, something like that, you could play on one of these weaker cards. A 1050 is pretty close in performance, by the way. That's close enough that I'd call it good, right? Going down to a GTX 950, 6660, RX 460, getting into some really old cards here. Again, you might have to go below 1080p, but you could probably still play the game if you're willing to do that. Now, coming up in performance, right, this is where if you leave it at low settings, you're going to stabilize your frame rates, above a 30 FPS average. Or if you want to lock 30, you could turn up the settings a little bit. That's getting us into like our, GTX 1650. So you'd have a 50% performance bump over our minimum card, giving you a little bit of wiggle room there on frame rates and or settings. And we can scroll through here, like your GTX 970 with a 74% performance jump. I'm sure there's going to be some way to hit, some better settings on that. And that's how we would read this chart. All right, I've got to get to work, guys. So I hope all of you have an excellent day. You're interested in this game? Let me know in the comments. Have an excellent day.